Thanks, Dave. Well, it's shaping up to be one of the biggest years for armchair generals out there. We've had a new StarCraft, Company of Heroes, and there's a new Total War on the way. But is there room for another contender? Enter Wargame, AirLand Battle.
Engaging target.
When I saw this, I thought two things. Firstly, that it's the most generic name for a video game in history. It's like calling a racing game drive game car vehicle racing, or a shooter gun shooter corridor fighting. And secondly, that they just made up the word airland. But as it turns out, AirLand Battle was a strategic doctrine used throughout the 80s, so I take back point two.
Fair enough. It's also worth mentioning that this is a sequel to 2012's Wargame European Escalation, which we never played, to be honest. So we're coming at this as complete newbies to the series with no notion of how it compares to the original. I mean, maybe it fixes things, maybe it breaks everything, we just don't know. We're just going to judge it completely on its own merits.
Yes, now normally I'd save my nitpicking to a little bit later in the review, but I'd like to get something out of the way first. There are a lot of typos in this game. Let me just get out my red pen here. There's one, there's another. Now, my spelling is far from perfect, but so much of the story is told through these text boxes. Actually, in retrospect, it's kind of a fun game trying to pick the typos, and it helped me pay attention to all of the story.
Yeah, but even with those text boxes, I had no idea what the story was supposed to be about. I think, from what I could gather, it was set during the Cold War in the 80s, except it's actually a hot war with two alliances in the form of NATO and Pact, who are fighting over Norway, Sweden, and Denmark for some reason.
Story aside, I was overwhelmed with all of the detail. Each alliance is obviously made up of various nations, and each nation has their own military hardware and various strengths and weaknesses, all based on their real-world stats. And on top of that, every single unit actually has to worry about fuel and ammo. And when you look at each unit, there's about 50 different stats to each of them. And with over 350 units, that's a lot of depth.
Bring it on.
Yes, well, I'd imagine for military buffs, you know the difference between an AMX 308 and an AMX 10 RC SB. It's a dream come true, but for the rest of us, it's a pretty daunting array of units and strategies to consider. But thankfully, you can still get your head around the basics with a little bit of practice, and the tutorials do a decent job of walking you through the main mechanics.
The single player is made up of 4 different campaigns, 2 of which have you playing as NATO, and the other 2 as Pact forces. Each campaign gives you an objective to capture certain areas within a time limit, and it's largely up to you to decide how to deploy and move your forces around the map. You also gain political points each turn, which you can spend to bring in reinforcements, or order in various types of support. You could provide air cover to a region, or even call in a nuclear strike, for example. And of course, if you and the enemy forces meet in the same region, then it's down to the battlefield.
There's a fairly epic scale to the fights too, isn't there? I always love a game that lets you zoom so far out from the battlefield that you can hear the sounds of a busy command center issuing orders out in the ground, but then you can still zoom right down to see the grass waving in the fields.
Go ahead, over.
That said, I found it a bit strange how much they limit the scope of each encounter. You're given just 20 minutes to either destroy every enemy command vehicle or simply destroy enough units to reach a certain number of points. If you don't accomplish that, then it counts as a draw and the battle continues on the next day. But if you lose, then that's the battle lost for good. There's no retry.
Yeah, and given the huge size of these maps and how slow units move, 20 minutes feels very restrictive. I'm always a bit of a slow thinker when it comes to strategy games. I like to fortify my position, build up a good army, and then wait until I can steamroll over everything before I charge out of the base. But you can't really do that here. You have to have a plan of attack and execute it perfectly.
Yeah, it just felt so strange to me though. I mean, often I'd be halfway through an attack and then suddenly I'd won just because I'd reached the point cap. And even with a victory, you often need to fight that battalion again the next day to wipe them out. I mean, what kind of war is that? Oh, well, we've got 1,000 points today. I guess we'll just stop this battle we're winning and come back tomorrow and see how many points we can get then.
Yes, when you put it like that, it does sound a bit silly, doesn't it? What did you think of the multiplayer?
Well, I know I always say this with strategy games, but this really took things to a new level. Wow, was I bad at this online. I think I actually managed to do just about everything wrong. I mean, within about 2 seconds of the game starting, one of my teammates said I should die of a horrible disease, and, you know, I didn't blame him, I was that bad.
Yes, I was terrible as well, and while this game may be rated PG, the chat menu certainly isn't. They are a serious bunch online. But I think for those who dedicate the time to learn the units and strategies, there's a lot to like. The main mode is a 10 versus 10 game, which is certainly more players than you get in your average strategy game, and leads to some fairly epic matches. But yes, I was definitely doing something wrong because I always seem to have just 3 little tanks when everyone else had heaps of units.
Got something for me?
And there is also the option to play through the campaign online, which I didn't do, but I think could be quite fun if you had a friend to play against. And there's leaderboards and replays, and you can even save matches, which is always a nice feature. And you can build up your own custom deck or army, so for those who know what they're doing, there's lots of options. I'm a little bit torn on this one because while on a personal level I didn't have that much fun with it, I do think it's a really solid strategy game, and for people who love comparing stats and strategies, I think they'll be absorbed for hours. I'm giving it 7 out of 10.
Yeah, I agree with you. I'm so glad games like this exist, which have this amount of depth in them, because they always do find an audience, even if it's not my personal taste. So I'm going to give this 7 as well.